Well, good morning to you all. Many of you will know me, but if you're visiting or new to St Matthew's, my name's John, and I've been coming to St Matthew's for more than 25 years. And just to be clear, I am not the vicar. I'm a normal person. Now, Jim, the proper vicar, if you like, he's on holiday. And I've taken the liberty of putting my car in his reserved parking place. While the vicar is away, the mice will play or something like that. Anyway, he's asked me to speak on the theme of God the Father. Now, he gave the first sermon in this series on the Nicene Creed, but actually it was some time ago, 5 weeks ago, at the end of June. So if you want a refresher about the history and background of the Creed, you can listen again through the YouTube channel. And of course it's topical in some senses because the Nicene Creed is 1700 years old this year. It was in 325 AD that the Council of Nicaea met. And there are going to be 4 talks all through August planned for the Sundays, all on the Nicene Creed. And my talk is based on the opening paragraph of the Nicene Creed. Now, where are we going with this talk? Well, first we're going to look at the text of part of the Creed, the first opening paragraph, and I'll make a few short comments about it. But the main part will be about the science and religion debate and some historical consequences. Now, to be clear, I'm not going to be going over the details of the debate. I won't be analysing the issues, but rather thinking of a couple of consequences about when people move away from biblical faith and the wisdom of the church over the centuries. I'm going to skim through a lot of ideas which deserve more detailed analysis, frankly. But it's the summer holidays, and no one was going to thank me for speaking for 3 or 4 hours. The important thing to take away is this. It's to know that there are some proper, clever clogs people who do read and think and talk and engage with difficult ideas. Now, personally, I am far from the top of the intellectual tree, but I do have some modest credentials in this area. I can think for myself. I spent 8 years at university, including 4 years in science research while I studied for the PhD. I've read lots of books at the time and since on philosophy, epistemology, science, history, art, atheism, amongst many other topics as well. And I've read Christian commentaries on all of these areas. My message is one of reassurance. What you need to know is that there are Christians right at the top of research in their areas of study who not only engage in the debates, but find that their faith is strengthened by what they discover. Often, their voices are not heard in the media because generally, adopting Christian values, they are more modest and humble and don't seek publicity. And the contrast with some atheists is quite striking. Often, they latch onto a few narrow, selected ideas, then become so convinced that they're right, they cannot hear other points of view. And boy, do some of them make a lot of noise. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins and the so-called militant atheists. Anyway, let's get back on track. There's 3 blokes on the golf course in heaven. There's Moses, Jesus, and an old guy. Moses tees off a belter, and the ball sails down the fairway, but then drops straight into the middle of the lake. Moses holds out his arms and parts the waters, takes the next shot from the bottom of the dry lake, and the ball pops into the hole. Jesus says, "Nice one." The old guy says, "Good work." So it's Jesus' turn. He tees off, and again, it's a great drive. but the ball plops into the middle of the lake. So Jesus walks across the water and with the next shot puts the ball straight into the hole. Moses says, "Nice one." The old guy says, "Good work." Finally, the old guy tees off. It's a feeble slice and it takes the ball straight into the rough. But suddenly a huge lion springs out and with a mighty swipe of its huge paw, he knocks the ball down the fairway and straight into the lake. And suddenly a great fish pops the ball into its mouth and spits it high in the air. And suddenly a great eagle swoops out of the sky, catches the ball and drops it onto the green, where it rolls downhill away from the hole. And suddenly there's a rush of mighty wind and it blows the ball uphill straight for a hole in one. Moses says, "Nice one." Jesus says, "Good work, Dad." And so that's a reminder. We are speaking about God the Father, if you like, Jesus' dad. And here's the text of the beginning of the Nicene Creed. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is, seen and unseen. So just a few quick thoughts on that. We believe in God. And this is so important. We together, not just me or the relatively few that are here in church, we all over earth and through 20 centuries of history, we hold these same ideas, these strong beliefs, this faith which gives us identity and purpose, this faith which energizes and gives security. Sometimes we might feel a little bit on our own believing in God and coming to church. We feel that Christianity is in retreat, with buildings in decay and numbers falling. But in a proper perspective, this is a story from our current times and over the last century, based on our experience in England. Encouragingly, though, in this new century, it appears that this decline is being reversed in England. But if we escape from this narrow English view, if we get a global perspective, we might be encouraged to know that a third of the world's population, some 2.3 billion people, a third of the world's population is Christian. Moreover, that proportion is increasing. When I was in Malaysia, I asked a vicar about the challenges his particular church faced. His response, "How do I cope with the increase in my church congregation by another 2,000? His weekly attendance was 10,000 a week, one church, and it was increasing rapidly towards 12,000. It's not a problem we have yet. We believe in God the Father, the Father. Of course, this doesn't speak of a biological fatherhood. Instead, it speaks about the closeness of the relationship between God and ourselves. God the Father. It speaks of trust, protection, authority, wisdom, and care. The best sort of fatherhood. God, the Father of Jesus. God, our Father. God, the Father of everything. And we believe in God, the Maker. And this speaks of God's role in creation. Excuse me. I want to talk about the debate about the origins of life and indeed the universe, where everything came from. Clearly, in church here, we believe in God the Creator. That's a core belief in this Nicene Creed. He, God, is the source of all that exists. But Christians hold a range of views about how scientific accounts of the origins of the earth relate to biblical accounts. The evolution story from science was developed following the discovery of fossils around 200 years ago, notably on the Jurassic coast in Devon. Evidence of dinosaurs in the fossil record and the obvious lack of dinosaurs on Earth through recorded human history led to the idea that species come and go and that they change over millions of years. Darwin takes the credit for giving a comprehensive theory about the reasons why this happens, though there have been other contributors and there have been significant revisions since the publication of his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And if anybody wants to borrow my copy, you're welcome to do it. These ideas were supported by several branches of science, most particularly geology, which showed that the Earth was many millions of years old. Scientists hold what is known as an old Earth view, that the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old and the universe some 15 billion years old. Now, some Christians hold a belief known as creationism, that the world and everything in it was created by God in 6 days, as described in the first chapter of Genesis. Some creationists hold that the word day may be longer than 24 hours, and there are other variations. But generally, creationists hold what's called a young Earth view. That is, that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. A different way of using the first chapter of Genesis to inform Christian faith is called intelligent design. This group of believers sees the hand of God, the intelligent designer, working in and through the development of life. Often they point towards the eye as an example of evidence of intelligent design in a biological structure. The eye, they say, was specially created by God for its purpose to enable vision. For this group, the length of Earth's history is less important. A third group of Christians holds that a literal interpretation of the first chapter of Genesis is inappropriate and a misuse of biblical text. They show that there are 3 different creation stories in the Bible, 2 in the book of Genesis and another in the book of Job. Each account serves a different purpose. They see the first chapter of Genesis as describing God's role in creation, God's relationship with the natural world, and man's relationship in creation with God. Together, these ideas address the question of why the universe exists. They say scientific ideas actually address a different question, namely how the universe came to be as it is. According to this group of Christians, there is no conflict in holding both evolution and Bible accounts to be true, but since they address different questions, one why, the other how. I'll pin my colours to the mast. I belong in that third group. Now let's get some numbers. Now there's a research group known as Pew Research that surveys what Christians believe, indeed all people believe. Surveys show that in the UK, roughly 70% of Christians hold an old Earth view. That is, the view that life evolved slowly over millions of years. There's roughly 10% who hold an intelligent design view, roughly 10% a creationist view, and about 10% who are uncommitted and unsure. Now, these numbers contrast strongly with those in the United States, where there are some 40% who are creationist and another 20% who are intelligent design holders. Now, if everybody could hold their opinions lightly, they could hear and respect different points of view. But unfortunately, this is one topic that causes some people to shout and get angry, and in those circumstances, opinions become entrenched and people take sides. Noisy people sometimes ridicule those who hold a different point of view and want to force their ideas on others. Some take things further and move towards fundamentalism, where they legitimize forcing people to adopt their opinion. Some Christians have been and are unhelpful because they say, indeed, some preach, that those who have real faith believe that the world was created in 6 days, and that those who do not hold this belief in a 6-day creation are weak and wishy-washy in their faith. They say that since the Bible is the Word of God, every word must be literally true. And some Christians have also been unhelpful. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins and his highly influential book, The God Delusion. He poured scorn on Christianity by using scientific ideas to criticize creationism. He sought and received a huge amount of publicity. And there are other writers who you might have come across who follow similar patterns of reasoning. You may have come across articles by Polly Toynbee, Christopher Hitchens, or Alice Roberts. Now, why does this belief that we hold in God the Maker, why does it really matter? Well, a first reason. If we take our faith seriously, we must engage with our critics. Amongst my own friends, the main reason that they do not take faith seriously is because they focus on a single issue, and that becomes a deal breaker. Oh, I can't have anything to do with church because of this one single issue. One holds that religious persecution in the 16th and 17th century, and more recently illustrated by radical Muslims, they together show that religious belief is not only nonsense, but that it is bad for people. Another of my friends focuses on church finance, saying that the immense wealth controlled by church commissioners is completely at odds with the moral values preached by the church. He sees Christians as hypocrites. A third friend is strongly taken by the perceived conflict between science and religion, and has come to the view that science disproves Christianity and religious belief. Now, many people prefer not to examine the views that they hold, not least because people tend to hear the story that reinforces a belief that they already hold, and then leave the reasons for holding their belief unexamined. Some do look at evidence, though, and I want to draw attention to 3 people who examined the evidence of what they were looking at and changed their own view and converted to Christianity. 3 examples. And I choose first a research scientist, absolutely at the top of his work. Francis Collins was the director of the Human Genome Project, the international collaboration set up to sequence the entire human genome. A massive, huge achievement, a huge task. And it now provides the basis for bringing huge health benefits. And you can look on Wikipedia about his status in the scientific community. In 2006, he wrote a book called The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief. In the book, he describes how the study of science, and particularly this Human Genome Project, forced him to examine the assumptions held by many other scientists and academics in other fields of research. Together, the scientific community often assume agnosticism and entertain atheism uncritically, mostly without examining any evidence. I'll mention David Wilkinson. His titles include both Reverend and Professor. His own research places him as a leading 20th century astrophysicist. And while his name may not be well known to you, you might have heard of Stephen Hawking, but most people haven't heard of many astrophysicists. But let me assure you, he is up there with the leaders in the field. He speaks regularly about how Christian faith and science inform each other. They help each other. And finally, I'll mention Tom Holland. He's an academic historian, widely recognized as a leading scholar. And his area of expertise is on how people change their beliefs and how people think, their worldviews. In his book, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, in other words, how we think today, he describes how Christianity has taken over the entire world as people have gradually accepted the ideas, assumptions, and values developed by the medieval church, largely here in England. And these beliefs form the basis for the international agreements we now have on justice, trade, human rights, treaties, and finance. As he researched the book, he converted to Christian faith. He was drawn by the power of faith to improve lives. So that's the first reason. Okay. A second reason why belief in the creed is important. Some people have specifically rejected the creed for political ends. It served them. And historically, we can look at the French Revolution. It was the first attempt to set up a secular state. The revolutionaries criticized the so-called outmoded views of the church. And a direct consequence of that criticism of the church caused people to rise up and murder some 5,000 priests. It was called the Reign of Terror. 20th century history is marked by atheistic leaders. Adolf Hitler used ideas from Darwin to idolize the superiority of the Aryan race as a justification for exterminating Jews. And specifically, you can read about Mao in China, Stalin and Lenin in the Soviet Union, Ceausescu in Romania, Pol Pot in Cambodia. Each of these leaders was responsible for the deaths of substantial proportions of their own populations. And each specifically rejected religion. And it was popularized, if you know it, in John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. And he said, imagine people living lives in peace. But of course, he didn't read sufficient history. He didn't know that the consequence of imagining no religion was actually the deaths of many tens, indeed hundreds of millions of people. Now, I do have to say, in this 21st century, younger people, and I'm not in that group, unfortunately, any longer, younger people are now moving away from the 20th century atheisms and are far more open to holding religious identity, holding faith. And I find that warmly encouraging. I believe in the context of history, let's say in 500 years' time, when we look back at our lives, this 20th century atheism will be seen as a short blip, a madness, when many people lost their sense of perspective, lost their identity, lost their way. But at least we know what we stand for. We stand for the creed. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is, seen and unseen. Amen.